What's the price of a referendum vote? Will a pay rise of £1.34 an hour be enough to change some voters' minds? Tonight we ask, who are the key voters and what do they want? Good evening and welcome to Scotland 2014. On the programme tonight, forget Tony Blair's Mondeo man and Bill Clinton's soccer moms. The referendum has created a new target for politicians to chase. We're dipping into the world of Easterhouse man and woman. The question is, will a hike in the minimum wage and the prospects of higher benefits change the way they'll vote? I'll be discussing that with Labour's Anna Sarwar and Patrick Harvie from the Greens. We've been on a journey around Scotland to see how the disabled vote might sway the referendum result and what was in the Queen's speech for her Scottish subjects. Where are the voters who hold the key to September's referendum? That's the question we'll be asking tonight. From the so-called working poor to the disabled vote, how are the campaigns trying to slice and dice the electorate, and is it working? Today, welfare experts have recommended the minimum wage should go up by more than £1 an hour, as well as suggesting there should be substantial benefit increases in an independent Scotland. So are these the kind of giveaways that could tempt voters into voting yes? Julie Peacock's been trying to find out.
Are you yes or no? It's not just ballot papers being put in boxes, we are too. And when it comes to the referendum, labels matter.
In every election, there's a type of voter that the politicians are just desperate to attract. Once upon a time, it was Thatcher's Essex man in his white van. Then along came Mondeo man to give Labour a lift to power in '97. And now in this independence referendum, there's a new target. Who is it? Well, for the sake of argument, we'll call him Easterhouse man or woman.
So who are we talking about? Well, it's people from working class areas on lower incomes who lean to the left. And the evidence suggests many are for independence.
And what we found is a direct link, really, in all the polls that we've done between where you live and how likely you are to vote yes or no in the referendum. So those that live in the most deprived neighbourhoods of Scotland are more likely to vote yes, and those that live in the most affluent neighbourhoods of Scotland are more likely to vote no.
It's an advantage the SNP are clearly keen to drive home. Today, the SNP government's given its backing to a report that recommends an overhaul of the welfare system. It's promising to increase benefits with inflation in an independent Scotland and increase allowances for carers. It's even considering raising the minimum wage.
The message that says we can do things differently and better in an independent Scotland is one that has some appeal, and rightly so, because this is about taking responsibility. It's about saying we're the 14th richest country in the world, but we've also got one of the biggest gaps between the richest in our society and the poorest in our society.
So where do we find our Easterhouse voter on a wet Wednesday afternoon? Despite the labels, not everyone here is convinced by the SNP's plans.
It's all right saying increase the minimum wage, but when you can't get a job, what good's the you talking, increasing the minimum wage? Well, the kids have not got a job to go to, so...
I prefer it to stay the same way. I don't want to use euros or anything like that. I've used them when I've been on holiday and I just don't like them.
They all talk the same, they all say the same, they're going to do this, they're going to do that. Then when they get in, they all do the bloody same, so...
But back in dry land in the Bridge Cafe, others believe independence would be good for areas like Easterhouse, and voters here could tip the balance.
I think the working class are the same. I believe the working class are higher up the ranks you go, I think it maybe still be no. If you're in among the working classes, I think the yes vote will be a strong vote.
And why is that?
I do not know, but I just feel that. I've got quite a number of friends who I meet. We're all working class, we all grew up together. There's about 2 no's in it. The rest are all yes. In fact, see a lot of the working class, they're keen on it. They're keen on the yes vote.
But many minds haven't been made up yet.
I think you need to look at the pros and cons and weigh that up. Would we be better off or would we not? Because it would be good in a way to be ourselves, but then is things going to go downhill? Is prices going to shoot up, going to be more poverty. Don't know. Didn't need to talk me round.
The welfare proposals may convince some, but with another report out today suggesting an independent Scotland could see spending cuts and higher taxes, perhaps just as many will be asking how we can afford it.
Well, joining me now from our Dundee studio is Anna Sarwar, Deputy Leader of the Scottish Labour Party, and here with me in Glasgow is Patrick Harvie, co-convener of the Scottish Green Party, and you are of course part of the Yes campaign. So the question at the end of the film there really is the question for you. How on earth could you pay for these benefit increases in an independent Scotland when the Institute of Fiscal Studies report today says an independent Scotland couldn't afford anything like this?
Well, I think pretty much everybody, including the Labour Party, have accepted that Scotland is a wealthy country and could afford to be independent. This is ultimately about the choices that an independent Scotland would wish to make.
But the IFS aren't saying that an independent Scotland couldn't afford to run itself and wouldn't be a wealthy country. They're simply saying that it would face a higher deficit that would mean that the promises made in the White Paper already, not even these additional welfare promises, would be totally unaffordable.
Well, if Scotland was independent, it would be able to make its own decisions about how quickly deficit needed to be reduced. Those would be different positions that the different political parties would put forward. We wouldn't be locked in to the austerity model that the UK government is imposing on us. And ultimately, we would be able to make the decision about moving toward a more equal society, a fairer distribution of the wealth of our society, of this wealthy society, closing the gap between the richest and the rest, which we've seen grow ever wider under years of growth and years of recession in the UK.
Mr Sarwar, it must be difficult for you to listen to these promises being made on welfare and try and find a way to counter them when inside the UK the Labour Party have been completely unable to stop any of the benefit changes the coalition have brought in.
No, far from it. I think you heard from Patrick's answer there that they don't know the answer to the fact that the IFS report today, remember this isn't some kind of political organisation, this is neutral economic experts saying that purely to stand still after independence we would need to find £6 billion of tax rises or spending cuts, 1.2 billion more on top of that if you take the manifesto commitments from the SNP in the White Paper. And the thing that I find really uncomfortable from this, and I know from Patrick that he finds really uncomfortable about the case being made for independence, is we're not being promised these massive tax rises for the wealthiest. We've been promised tax cuts for the wealthiest, a cut to corporation tax being a perfect example. That's why I think the more appropriate approach is to pool and share a resource right across the UK, tax the bankers through the roof, through the bankers' bonus tax right across the UK, and use that to pay for a jobs guarantee scheme for young workers in Scotland, but also right across the UK. That sounds like a much more fairer form of welfare to me than the one being proposed by the nationalists.
Do you think people will believe that you can both increase spending and cut taxes in independent Scotland and make the sums add up?
Well, that's certainly not the case that I've advanced, and Annis is quite right that I disagree with some SNP policies like the cut to corporation tax. It has to be said, cutting corporation tax is a policy that we've seen from UK government after UK government after UK government, whether it was Labour, Tory or now the coalition.
Well, with the SNP promising to cut it even further no matter how low it goes in the UK.
I look forward to challenging that policy in an independent Scotland, and I look forward to being on the same side of that argument as Anna Sarwar if Labour has genuinely ditched the idea of low corporation tax.
But the challenge
the argument on welfare, I think, is really important here, and I don't agree with every dot and comma in the government's report, the expert group's report on welfare in an independent Scotland, but I do think it engages really positively with the purpose of welfare. The benefit system in the UK has abandoned the purpose of human welfare. Its purpose is now twofold. One is to bully people into low-paid work, and the other is to subsidise low pay so that big employers can pay poverty wages that don't allow people to live with a bit of dignity.
Well, look,
I think
Patrick,
we need to repurpose the whole thing. We need to re-win the argument for a welfare state where we actually look after all people, where all people's dignity is important, and we don't use divisive rhetoric that sets hard-working families against scroungers and skivers. That's so poisonous in our society.
Mr Sarwar, I'm sure you will agree with a large part of that. So why will the Labour Party not say that you would devolve welfare spending to the Holyrood government?
No, I absolutely share Patrick's commitment on that, and also I would use the exact same language that Patrick has used in terms of how others have tried to frame this debate around welfare. But the challenge is not the UK attacking welfare, it's the Tories attacking welfare. So let's not pretend that England, those living in England, those living in Wales, those living in Northern Ireland somehow are attacking our welfare state. They're not.
It was the Labour Party who voted for the benefit cap alongside the coalition.
But if you let me finish, the reality is, and polls this week have shown that, is that actually by pooling and sharing our resource across the UK, we can ensure that we have the same level of pension right across the UK, the same level of benefits right across the UK, which the vast majority of people in Scotland and indeed right across the UK want to see. And I agree with Patrick, let's make the case for the welfare state. Let's make the case for making sure that we have the right support for people to get back into work, and when they're back in the work, they get the support they need to stay in work and be an asset to their own community. But the reality is that's not what we've offered here. The paper you saw today wasn't about because they want to create better life opportunities for families right across the country. It's because Alex Salmond wants to make history.
So why not devolve these powers to the Holyrood government? Because you've been unable to alter the coalition's policies from London. Why not allow Edinburgh to make these decisions?
So that's a really important question, and that's why we have said we want to devolve significant new welfare powers to Scotland as part of our own devolution, which is around housing benefit, around attendance allowance. But the reason why we don't want to devolve, for example, pensions to Scotland is because that pooling and sharing of resources argument, I think, is a strength. A taxpayer in Aberdeen helps support someone with disabilities in Cardiff, or a taxpayer in London helps support someone who's unemployed right here in Dundee or in Glasgow.
A country on the scale and size of the UK does have greater potential to pool and share resources. And if I had seen that happening over the last few decades, I might even have ended up on the other side of this independence debate. But I've seen the opposite happening. I've seen this big country with the potential to pool and share resources do the opposite, and the gap between the richest and the rest grow ever wider. That's what I want to change, and Scotland really should take the opportunity to do it for itself.
We'll have to leave it there, gents. Mr. Harvie, Mr. Sarwar, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Now, according to the last census, there are 1 million Scots with some sort of disability. That's 1 in 5 of us. So is there such a thing as a disability vote? And how will that play out in September's referendum? Ian Hamilton has this special report.
I'm about to go on a very interesting journey around Scotland to find out what some of the disabled people think around the country about the forthcoming referendum. According to the last census, there are 1 million disabled people in Scotland. But how will they vote, and could they affect the outcome? 1 million sounds a lot, but that's the most accurate figure we have available since the last census. And not everyone of that 1 million are disabled all the time. The first stop on my trip is to Edinburgh to meet Bill Scott from Inclusion Scotland. Do you think this 1 million people could have an impact in the forthcoming referendum?
Well, undoubtedly. The polls are showing that yes, no positions are moving closer and closer, so that 1 million people are definitely a huge battleground for both campaigns.
It's not a homogenous group.
No, they're definitely not a homogenous group. You know, many disabled people wouldn't even self-identify as a disabled person, so appealing to them as disabled people, you wouldn't even necessarily get their attention.
Next, I travelled to Glasgow to meet Peter Scott, who's the Chief Executive of Enable Scotland.
People who have a learning disability are not particularly interested in issues like fluctuating oil revenues and currency unions and European Union membership. They want to know about what will be the impact in their daily life. Issues like access to healthcare and inequality within healthcare, issues around social care and social work and how it's going to be funded in the future, and a whole host of issues that are not unique to the disabled population, but are very important to them, and they're not hearing answers as yet.
I travelled down the road to the Glasgow Disability Alliance to find out where the campaign is engaging with disabled people.
We've asked people that very question, you know, do you feel that you're getting enough information? Do you understand the process? And quite a few disabled people that we've talked to have said that they feel that they're not necessarily being engaged in the process. So the general feedback is that they're not necessarily getting the information that they want or that they need, particularly in the mainstream environment. they may be able to get it from other disability organisations or from ourselves, but they're not necessarily getting it out there in the wider world.
We're on our way to Aberdeen to meet Professor Paul Spicker at Robert Gordon University. So when we start to talk about things like the disability vote, or even, dare I say it, the disability pound or disability anything for that matter, does it exist?
I'm not convinced that it does. I think the problem is that there are so many people with disabilities who really don't want to put themselves in that particular box, that they'd be very reluctant to make that the largest part of their life. But of course, there are so many people who do have disabilities and disabling conditions, and so many of us who have people in that situation in our families, you would have thought it would play a much larger part.
The 1 million disabled Scots might not be an homogeneous group, and a great number of them might not even want to be labelled as a disabled person. Nevertheless, of the disabled people that I spoke to on this trip, many believe that the yes and the no campaigns are not doing enough to engage with them in order that they can make the right decision come September.
To find out just how cynically the politicians slice and dice the electorate, I'm joined now from London by Scotland's most famous psophologist, John Curtis. Are we being too cynical here, John Curtis, to think that when the SNP start talking about increasing benefits and increasing the minimum wage, that that's a naked play for people who rely on benefits, whether they're in work or not, to try and get them to vote for an independent Scotland because there would be something in it for them financially?
Well, let's take the adjectives out of it, but certainly one can see how some of the claims made by both sides appear to be designed to appeal to either a section of the electorate in which they are doing weakly, or, as in this case, sections of the electorate where they seem to do rather well. So to take the first point, it's pretty clear that the biggest weakness that the Yes side face demographically is that their support is much lower amongst women than amongst men. They seem to try to counter that by making, as it were, the signal policy offer. Back when the Independence White Paper was launched in November, the promise of more childcare. In truth, it's not clear at all that that succeeded in reducing the gender gap, but it did seem to suggest that certainly the Yes side thought, well, we do need to make something that particularly we think will appeal to women in order to try to reduce that disadvantage. Now, on the other side of the coin, as Mark Diffley pointed out in your earlier package, it's pretty clear that people who are less well off, people in working class backgrounds, people who live in less deprived areas are more likely to vote yes, probably because they think there's less of risk, they've got less to lose, and certainly they're rather more optimistic about the economic consequences of Scotland becoming independent than are those in more middle-class, secure situations. And maybe certainly, therefore, the SNP might be wanting to try and reinforce that support and to improve their ability to eat into a demographic which otherwise you might think would be more likely to vote Labour and therefore might be swayed by the Labour Party to vote in the Unionist vote. And I think it's no secret that places like Easterhouse are amongst those in which the Yes side have been focusing a lot of their doorstep canvassing activity in the belief that those voters in particular are a crucial group that they need to, in order if they're going to get a Yes victory in September.
So can you sum up who the key target undecided voters are? Who are 2014's Mondeo man or soccer mom?
You could be asking me two different questions there. Question number one, you could be asking me, who are the voters who are most likely to be undecided? The answer to that question is A, women, B, those people who have a dual sense of identity, they feel both British and they feel Scottish, and 3, people whose most preferred outcome would actually be a stronger Scottish Parliament within the framework of the Union. Those are groups that previous research suggests are most likely to say they're not quite sure what they're going to do. If, on the other hand, you want to identify which are the groups that are things that most distinguish yes voters from no voters, well, again, as I've already said, it's gender, it's partly to do with class. The other thing is undoubtedly age. Voters over the age of 60 or so are less likely to be in favour of independence than those who are younger. Here, the argument seems to be not so much to do with economics or what's in it for me, But in truth, the underlying issue of identity, older voters are more likely to have a strong sense of British identity. And although the yes side are rather reluctant to admit that identity is part of what this referendum is about, it is part of what it's about. The more Scottish you feel, the more likely you are to be in favour of a yes vote. So that older group with a rather strong sense of British identity, some of whom can actually remember something about the British Empire, are less likely to be in favour of a yes vote.
John Curtis, thanks very much for that. Her Majesty got into a brand new gilded carriage today and headed off to Westminster to deliver the last Queen's speech of this Parliament. She told us her government intended to press ahead with major pensions reform, they'll make fracking easier, and they're going to try and find a way to recall badly behaved MPs. But what did the Queen have to say to her subjects north of the border? Well, our Westminster correspondent Tim Reid watched the speech, and I asked him what was in it for Scotland.
For the Scottish Parliament, and make the case for Scotland to remain a part of the United Kingdom.
Well, our Westminster correspondent Tim Reid watched the speech, and I asked him what was in it for Scotland.
Well, ministers would argue that the vast majority of the measures in the Queen's speech do apply in some way, shape or form to Scotland. In fact, they say on this occasion it's 9 out of the 11 new bills. And as you mentioned, the pensions reform is their kind of flagship policy. People doing away with annuities for people in their retirement, much more secure pension pots, say ministers. But also the marriage couples tax allowance, and also help for parents with childcare through the tax system as well. Help for businesses, smaller businesses in particular, but also those businesses which are flouting minimum wage rules. So that will be tackled in the next year of the Parliament. And in terms of Scotland particularly, the North Sea gets a mention in this speech because the government wants to introduce the entire full recommendations of the Wood report, remember, into the North Sea, into trying to get the most out of the North Sea over the next 20 years. That will be introduced, but also making the industry pay for the regulatory body. And that, we're told by Alistair Carmichael, the Scottish Secretary, will be introduced before the summer recess, which of course also means before the referendum.
In her speech, we heard the Queen say that her government would be working to make sure Scotland stays part of the United Kingdom. She doesn't write this speech, but when you hear the words out of her own mouth, it does sound quite political.
Yeah, she said a similar thing last year, but I think the important thing is it is written by ministers. She simply reads it out, and the UK government has made it clear it wants Scotland to remain in the United Kingdom. It is something, of course, the Scottish nationalists would say she is simply stating a fact, and that she will be the figurehead, the head of state in an independent Scotland. They, of course, say the Queen's speech here has done nothing for the people of Scotland, and that only Scotland, with its own powers, will be able to deal with its own resources and to sort out its own economy, and that, of course, are all referendum issues.
Now we'll take a look at some of the other stories making headlines around the world tonight. One baby has died and 14 are ill with blood poisoning after being given what appears to be a contaminated batch of liquid food. On Al Jazeera, the US president accuses Russia of dark tactics and bullying in Ukraine. And the Washington Post report on an investigation into a former home in Ireland where hundreds of dead children were found in a septic tank. Well, and here to discuss some of the big issues of the day are Noura El-Gailani, Curator of Islamic Civilizations at Glasgow Museums, and Alistair McIntosh, author and independent academic. And let's pick up on the Queen's speech there. Watching all the pomp and ceremony, it's not... People around the world find it bizarre. BuzzFeed were running 18 reasons why the Queen's speech is a really weird ceremony. From outside the UK, it probably does look quite strange. Is it time to update it, Alistair?
Well, it does take Britain back to its feudal days, gilt carriages and all of that. And so it is an antiquated ceremony. We have to ask, does it reflect the kind of people who we are today? Now, for some people, it very much does. And I have to say that, you know, when you see the Queen at her age undergoing all of that, you have to think what a paragon of public service she is. And yet, when you deconstruct the principles of power that are expressed in that, is that really how we understand our democracy in modern times.
Some people didn't. Someone like Aidan John Moffat was tweeting today saying the Queen's speech is live on the BBC. Look at it. This exists in the 21st century. He obviously thinks it's time to update it. But Nuri, as somebody who didn't grow up in the UK, when you watch our pomp and circumstance at its best, how does it make you feel?
Well, it is very interesting to watch, but I must say now I've been here for a good 21 years. I find it is a symbol of stability, given that I come from such an unstable part of the world.
Iraq.
Yes, Iraq. And only yesterday, El Zaman newspaper, a local Iraqi one, was covering the subject of the Iraqi monarchy, which was toppled over in 1958, and harking back to those stable and positive days in comparison to what's happening to the people today, what they're doing to themselves as they fight over this new democratic experience in Iraq. And they want to set up a museum to learn about the monarchy period in Iraq.
And the SNP, of course, say that the Queen will remain as the head of state in an independent Scotland if we have one. Is that important for stability, or are they just saying that in order not to lose any royalist votes?
Well, I think they're saying, you know, we want to be like any other Commonwealth country. And you've got to remember that the current monarchical structure was structured when a Scottish king, James VI, went down to London to become James I in order to ensure the Protestant succession. Longer term, is it what we still want? I have to say, you know, I'm a bit of a greenie type myself, and I would say if we're going to get rid of it, let Charlie have his innings first and then see what happens then.
Now, there is quite a row brewing tonight over an interview Alistair Darling gave to the New Statesman when he compared Alex Salmond to Kim Jong-il. He was complaining about some statements that Alex Salmond had made about the BBC's coverage of the European elections. And unsurprisingly, the SNP are furious about this. Does it lower the tone of the whole debate when people make comparisons like this, or is it fair enough?
Ooh, for me, my reaction immediately was people sometimes get so frustrated. They do start to use names and do comparisons and hurt each other in the process. But perhaps some historical figures have become so notorious, it's impossible to use them as an example. It doesn't have its realism, let's say, and shouldn't be taken at all seriously.
Well, Angus Robertson, MP, who's the SNP leader at Westminster, was tweeting that it was an unacceptable low that Alistair Darling had talked about blood and soil nationalism, which is, of course, a phrase associated with the Nazis. Now, the New Statesman have told us tonight that they mistranscribed that Alistair Darling did not talk about blood and soil nationalism, that they will change the article. But he did make the comparison with Kim Jong-il. How do you feel the debate is faring in Scotland when people are using phrases like this?
Well, this is where we need what some people are calling respectful dialogue. To liken the democratically elected leader of Scotland to one of the most notorious dictators in the world is not respectful. And I'd better not say any more about how I feel, or I might not be being respectful to my old colleague in Aberdeen University days in the Student Representative Council, Alistair Darling.
Does it surprise you how language is used in this debate?
Yes, but I think when people fight for causes, people end up perhaps using many tools that they may regret later on. So.
Well, thank you both very much for coming in to talk to us. That's it for tonight. Thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Join us then.